from
work.
Jan Tinetti.
So, Minister, as a supplementary to that, you've talked about, and we all know that there's a significant level of death and serious workplace injury. I wonder if you know of how many of those workplaces where that has happened in the last year were inspected in the year prior to that happening?
On hand, I don't have that specific information, but we could potentially get someone from the health and safety or work safety team.
We are going to be seeing them 15 minutes afterwards. So
Okay, they don't
maybe
have it either.
we'll be seeing them afterwards anyway.
Okay.
So
We'll either ask that after
we'll
or
put it in
we'll put it in
writing.
writing.
Yeah.
Great.
That would be a good idea.
Okay. Jan, we can move on to your primary.
Okay, thank you. Minister, you have announced in 2 stages changes to health and safety. You made an announcement in March and one recently. Why did you make them in 2 different stages?
So we have multiple stages of announcents coming.
I'm talking
with
about the
health
one
and
in
safety.
March and this one recently.
Yes, and I've got more to come, which is what I'm alluding to. My work does not end, Jan. I've still got more. We have multi-stages for the health and safety because it is such a large tranche of work. And rather than waiting until cabinet decisions are made on every single element that goes through cabinet or every letter of expectation I send and waiting right until the end, I think it is important to allow people to know where the direction of travel is going as we make those decisions. So there have been various announcements. The ones that we have made to date are quite broad, but focus mainly on refocusing the entire health and safety system to reduce critical risks and reduce harm to workers. And that's really important. The whole focus of why we are doing this reform is we do actually want workers to come back safely every day to their families. I think it's quite heartbreaking when people don't return home, and we do want people to be safe. But on top of that, when we were going out around the country, hearing from business owners, managers and workers on the ground, which I think was really important, and I did consultation very differently to how government does. I went to hear from the people directly. They said that they had a lot of big concerns about the cost of compliance and whether or not that cost to comply is actually seeing a reduction in harm, and a fear from WorkSafe that, and in some cases, I even had comments that people had more fear of WorkSafe than the police turning up, and having such strong fear of the regulator rather than feeling that the regulator was there to help, I don't believe is conducive to a good health and safety system. So we are refocusing the system on providing more guidance upfront to businesses so that they have a positive relationship with WorkSafe. They understand what the rules are, what they need to do to comply and to reduce risks to serious injury and death in their workplaces, but also that everybody is aware that they don't need to be sweating the small stuff with small-scale paperwork compliance, but really focusing on targeting those critical risks that would be found in their workplace so that there is a prioritisation going on from the worker, the business and WorkSafe, that we care about deaths and serious injuries. We don't care about just making sure you've got a paperwork in the filing cabinet.
Okay, can I ask something? Thank you. So the Ministry for Regulation's feedback on your original cabinet paper has criticised the process of it coming out into tranches because they've said that one is reliant on the other, and this you're not able to, from what I can see here in their feedback, they're saying that there was sort of a lack of understanding of how that would interact in that because you haven't put them out together. But also exactly what you've just said around that low level, they've criticised the fact that there's been that emphasis on the low level risk compliance, health and safety compliance. And they say this assumes that time spent on low value health and safety compliance activity will instead be spent on higher value health and safety activity. But isn't it just as likely that the time and resources will go to non-health and safety activities? For example, activities that grow market share and earn revenue rather than on health and safety. So what evidence do you have, given that the Ministry of Regulations has said that, what evidence do you have that that time taken away from the low value health and safety would be spent in other areas in the health and safety?
Well, it's not necessarily about the time spent on compliance activity, Jan. What we're trying to do is reduce compliance burden to businesses in general. Time spent on compliance for compliance sake, I'm sure everybody in this room would agree, is not worth it if it's not actually seeing results. So if people are reducing time based on compliance, that's a good thing. If we're focusing on those critical risks, and that's the aim of this entire reform, we want people to focus on those critical risks. But if that comes at a reduction in time spent on those activities, then I would suggest that that's a good thing.
Tiana.
Yeah, just to stop on this, can the Minister give us their working definition on what critical risk is, and in her answer, if you could give the parameters of that, so your widest parameters of what would include critical risk right down to your narrower definition, and after you answer that, if you could also answer me whether you would include musculoskeletal harm within
Yeah.
critical risk, and if not, why not? And also mental harm. And the reasons why I ask that is there are significant harms that are caused because of musculoskeletal harm, back issues, spinal injuries, that kind of thing as well. And we know that mental health is a really, really big issue. So again, my question is around your working definition for critical risk, from your widest parameters of what you're considering right down to the narrowest parameters of what you are considering, and then also whether musculoskeletal harm is possibly going to be included in that, and mental harm.
Well, thank you for the question. The focus is about critical risks, like you rightly pointed out. At the moment, we are defining critical risks as those that cause death or serious injury or illness, but the specific details of what that involves is still to come. To Jan's point, still got a lot of announcements to come.
So on top of that, because we know that there is sometimes mental harm can move on to self-harm and also onto suicide. So is that possibly in the mix in terms of your definition for critical risk?
Look, I'm not going to be making an announcement today. I totally understand where your concern is coming from. However, you'll simply have to wait for.
I want to know whether it's actually in the mix in terms of the things that you're thinking about, or whether it's off the table or not. People want to know.
We will be making an announcement on the definitions of critical risk at a later date.
Okay, Parmjit.
So, Mr.
Okay, right, there's lots to unpack in that. The two stages, yeah, I get where Jan's coming from, because there's a lack of understanding on interaction between the two stages. Brooke answered because it's a large amount of work, and her focus is predominantly on critical risk. But if her priority is on critical risk, she should have a working definition by now.
Exactly. And are you working it on your own, or don't you have a team of EAs helping you?
Yeah, she should have a team. I mean, look, I've got the health and safety reform proposal right here in front of me, and I've even got the regulatory impact statement for that. So it's kind of interesting how she said her logic is that if we reduce compliance costs and risks to business owners, workers are somehow going to be safer. And I just don't see how that logically works, right? I get that, I mean, especially considering the fact that before, right, that labour inspectors have had an increase in 33% of interventions with migrant workers, right? So if she's asking, okay, we need to have a more positive relationship between WorkSafe and businesses. Well, the good news is for her that I actually agree with that statement, because based on that reform proposal, over 1,000 people were asked to provide feedback on the consultation document. And they did say that there is an issue with the way how WorkSafe, in terms of their consistency and in terms of the way how they communicate and simplicity of complying, right? But making things simpler is not the same thing as reducing compliance, right? So what I'm saying here is that you can simplify something and make it easier to comply with without reducing the level of responsibility on the business. And I think that's where Brooke is getting it wrong, is that she thinks that if we reduce the amount of responsibility on a business by deeming it to be low risk, therefore we make it less scary for the small business owner. But that's not what the regulatory impact statement, or the people that wrote that, the MBIE, that's not what they're asking for. They're asking that they need better communication between WorkSafe and businesses, which I agree with.
Yeah, and that could be a proper portal on WorkSafe's website where to report injuries. I hope that does exist.
Yep.
Possibly case managers that can be a go-to person rather than ringing, rather than like guessing and finding out. It's possibly ring. Can I check and double check? I mean, we have it with the health department stuff with councils. If you have any issues with food safety stuff, just give your health inspector a ring. And your health inspector, when you ask questions, are the most helpful people out there. I had a friend who was having a bit of a runaround. Gave him the phone number to the person who did my inspections, my last inspection. And bang, 20 of his questions were answered in one phone call. Because Louise knew what he was talking about.
Yeah, I mean, look, I can grab a direct quote from the impact statement. Submitters frequently raise concerns about WorkSafe's regulatory stance, a lack of help provided via guidance or inspectors, inconsistent approaches across inspectors, and a combative approach to business under investigation. We note that this feedback will likely reflect WorkSafe's past approach more than the steps that WorkSafe is taking under its new strategy, which will take time to filter through. So again, so WorkSafe has made amendments, and we haven't seen the results of that yet. But WorkSafe is aware that there is a problem with communication between them and businesses. Now, I don't know how many of the people, the 1,000 people or 1,000 business owners, have stated, "Oh, we don't like WorkSafe because of red tape." Like that doesn't appear
it's
to
usually
be
because
what they're commenting
you
on.
know, it's usually because they've had bad experience. I had a bad experience with WorkSafe when they went and did a surprise inspection on BP, and the lady from WorkSafe was so condescending that she, well, you're cafe team lead, you know nothing about safety. And it's like, I know what the basics you had to do for a job. Yes, my current role at BP was cafe team lead, but I also was a trained certified LPG filler. You know, as many of the male cafe team leads at BP were certified. You know, it just shows like the ridiculousness of. It's like when you have that type of experience, that puts a bad taste in the mouth. And maybe, you know, and that's where they need to sit and look at. This is something that IRD started 20 years ago, was compliance over catching people out. And with probably the exception of the Child Support Department, the overall positive relationship with the IRD has changed. So IRD started that in the Helen Clark era. And we are there now where people aren't so scared to sit and deal with the IRD. They have direct contacts. I mean, some people are still scared about, you know, ringing the IRD, possibly because they remember the stories of the 90s where the IRD would just basically behave like assholes. But the thing is, other government agencies have not changed from this catching out to compliance approach. It's the same with the health inspectors for councils. Health inspectors used to be known as having that type of arrangement. And as time went on, it went from being, catching people out to compliance to building relationships. And now, people who have those relationships have much better compliance rates. And that's what you need, is you need to build your relationship up.
Yeah, I mean, look at the stat. That came from the regulatory impact statement. 67% of submitters agreed that simpler and clearer guidelines would help them to understand their health and safety obligations. This is not the same as saying we have too many regulations we have to follow. These are not the same things.
Yeah.
You know, many submitters noted that the Act works well in general through commonly identified areas of concerns where general complexity of the system, you know, hazardous substances regulations, sections of Part 2 of the Act, such as clarity and approved codes of practice. So look, they're saying that, hey, this Act does work, but we need better communication.
Yeah, and that's probably...
Like as what you're highlighting before.
Yeah, and I don't think Brooke is the right minister to actually guide a government agency to shift from severe gotcha enforcement to compliance. Her party does not go down that path at all. It does not have a reputation of building relationships to have compliance. They like gotcha, let's catch you on the hoof type of thing.
Yeah, and I think this is why you'll often hear me saying I don't think ACT is a libertarian party, because I'm going to put I don't have a libertarian hat, but I got a hat on, so that counts. Well, as a libertarian, my response to this is, we need to improve communications between this agency and businesses. We need to have more transparency and clearer communications. We should put money towards that. Yeah. So workers are kept safe. But their approach has been to, there's too much red tape, even though there's nowhere in the report where the businesses are saying red tape is the problem. And, you know, it's like we got to get rid of all the rules and regulations and make it more unsafe for workers. I'm like, no, that's not what they're asking for. They're asking for a more participatory system, more transparency, better communication.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what we want. And maybe we need Chris Bishop to be in charge of that instead, because Chris Bishop is definitely.
I think he would be better.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's definitely the one about building relationships. I mean, that was evident between the Karen versus Chris on the Transport Select Committee. Scrutiny
I mean,
week.
there's areas that Bish needs to work on. I mean, for starters, not shouting at people when he's drunk. But otherwise, besides that, yeah, I'm pretty sure that he'll do a better job at this than Brooke.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's an example of. Yeah, we've already found a minister to clone to become the default minister.